Welcome back to Inkwater Tales. Tonight's stories are old ones. 6 parables from the old Zen teachers, quiet lessons softly told. A cup poured past full. A farmer who never rushed to call anything lucky or unlucky. 2 monks and a road no longer muddy. 4 candles and 1 very short silence. A man who answered every accusation the same gentle way. And an old hermit who gave away the only thing he owned. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the water settle. There is an old story the Zen teachers still tell their students about a professor who once made the long climb to a mountain temple. It was autumn in this telling, and the path was covered in fallen leaves, and the air already carried the first thin cold of the coming winter. The professor was a learned man, well known in the cities below, invited often to speak at gatherings, where younger scholars listened carefully to every word he offered. He had read every book there was to read about meditation and enlightenment and the nature of the mind. He had studied under other teachers, in other places, some kind, some difficult, and had formed, over many years of careful study, a great many opinions about what wisdom must surely look like once a person finally found it. He had heard of this particular mountain temple from a colleague, who spoke of the old master there with a strange kind of reverence the professor did not entirely understand, but was curious enough to investigate for himself. So he made the journey, by cart as far as the road allowed, and then on foot up the long winding path, past terraced fields already harvested for the season, past small shrines tucked into the rock where travelers left offerings of rice and incense. He arrived at the temple gate, a little breathless from the climb, his fine city robes dusted with the mountain's red earth, and was received warmly by an old master who lived there alone, tending a small garden and a smaller library, in a stillness the professor found, if he was honest, faintly unsettling. "I have come," the professor said, straightening his robes, "to ask you a few final questions, to complete my understanding." The old master only smiled, the way one smiles at a familiar kind of guest, having received many such visitors over the years, each one certain he would be the last to need any real teaching, and invited him inside, out of the cold, and set about preparing tea, the way any host prepares tea for anyone who has traveled far to see them. The professor sat and began to talk. He talked about the sutras he had studied, quoting several passages from memory with evident pride. He talked about the philosophers he had read and disagreed with, and the ones he had come, eventually, after long deliberation, to agree with instead. He talked about the ideas he had already formed, over the years, about what enlightenment must certainly be, and what it certainly was not, listing his conclusions one after another, as though reciting them from a well-organized ledger. The old master listened to all of it, without interrupting even once, his face giving away nothing at all, and poured. He poured the visitor's cup full, to the very brim, exactly as a good host should. And then he kept pouring. The tea rose past the rim, and spilled over the edge, and ran in a thin dark line across the polished wood of the table, and dripped slowly, one drop at a time, onto the floor below. The professor watched this happen for a long moment, too startled to speak. The old master's hand did not waver. The teapot did not tilt back. he simply kept pouring, calm and unhurried, as the tea continued spilling over the table and onto the floor. Finally, the professor could not stay silent any longer. "Stop," he said, a little sharply. "It's overflowing. Can't you see it won't hold any more?" The old master set the pot down at last, unhurried, and looked at his guest with something close to kindness. "Like this cup," he said, "you have come to me already full. Full of your own opinions, full of your own conclusions, full of every idea you have already decided, long before you climbed this mountain, must certainly be true." "How?" he asked gently. "Can I possibly show you anything at all, unless you first empty your cup?" The professor said nothing for a long moment. He looked down at the tea still dripping slowly from the edge of the table, one drop at a time, and found, to his own surprise, that he had nothing at all to say in response. There was nothing, he realized, that needed arguing. Not because he had been defeated, only because, for the first time in a very long while, he had run out of opinions to defend. He sat with the old master a while longer, in a silence that felt, strangely, more like a conversation than anything either of them had said aloud. When he finally walked back down the mountain path, in the last gray light of the afternoon, the fallen leaves crunching softly beneath his feet, something in him felt lighter than it had on the way up. Not because he had learned some new fact to add to everything else he already knew, only because he had, for the length of one cup of tea, set a few things down that he had been carrying for years without ever once noticing their weight. There was an old farmer in a village not so far from that same mountain who seemed to understand this same lesson without ever having read a single sutra or climbed a single mountain path to ask for it. His neighbors thought him strange, not because he was unkind or foolish, only because no matter what happened to him, good fortune or bad, he never seemed to rush to decide right away which one it truly was. That story is next. In one telling, there was once an old farmer who lived at the edge of a small village with a modest house of packed earth and thatch, a single field of grain that fed him through each winter, and one good horse, the only truly valuable thing he owned in the entire world. He was known among his neighbors for a certain quietness that some of them found admirable, and others found simply strange, even a little frustrating, in a village where opinions about luck and misfortune were traded as freely as vegetables at the morning market. One morning, quite early, before the mist had lifted from the low fields, and while the roosters were only just beginning their calling, the old farmer went out to the stable, as he did every day, and found the gate standing open, swinging slightly in the breeze, and the horse simply gone. It had wandered off sometime in the night, toward the wild hills beyond the village, and by the time anyone thought to look, its tracks had already faded into the dew and the churned mud of the yard. His neighbors came by that same afternoon, one after another, drawn by the news the way news always traveled fast in so small a village, each one arriving at his gate to offer their sympathy in turn. "Such terrible luck," they said, shaking their heads gravely. "Your only horse, and your best one, gone without a trace, right before the planting season." The old farmer only shrugged, mild as ever, setting down the bucket he had been carrying, and said, "Maybe." A few days later, as the farmer was mending a fence at the far edge of his field in the late afternoon sun, he heard hoofbeats on the path behind him and looked up to see his horse trotting home on its own, unhurried, exactly as though it had simply gone out for a long morning walk and lost track of the hour. But it had not come back alone. 3 wild horses followed close behind it, their coats rough and their eyes wary, drawn along by the old horse's calm and steady company, and all 3 wandered straight into the farmer's little corral, as if they had always belonged there, as if the fences had been built for them from the very beginning of the world. The neighbors came running again that evening, delighted this time, calling out from the road before they had even reached his gate, their earlier sympathy entirely forgotten. "What wonderful luck!" they cried. "4 horses now, where you once had only 1, and just in time for the harvest." The old farmer only shrugged again, exactly as before, tying the gate closed behind the new arrivals, and said, "Maybe." The farmer's only son, young and eager, and a little too confident in his own skill, took it upon himself to tame one of the new wild horses without waiting for his father's advice. He mounted it one bright morning while his father was still out in the field. The horse, unused to any rider at all, reared hard and threw him to the ground, and the boy's leg broke badly beneath him, in a way that would take many long months to heal. The neighbors came again, somber this time, their earlier delight entirely forgotten. "Such terrible luck," they said. "Your only son, crippled now, right when you need him most for the harvest." The old farmer only shrugged and said, "Maybe." Not long after this, word came through the village, carried by a tired traveling merchant, that the king's officers were moving from house to house across the whole region, taking every able young man to the far northern border, where a long and difficult campaign had recently begun. Every young man in the village was taken that week, one household after another, their mothers weeping quietly at the gates as they left. Every young man except one. The farmer's son, his leg still splinted and healing, was passed over entirely by the officers, who had no use for a young man who could not yet walk without a crutch. The neighbors came a final time that season, amazed now and more than a little humbled at the old man's strange fortune. "What extraordinary luck," they said quietly. "Your son spared when every other son in this village was taken." The old farmer, tending quietly to his field, as he always had, exactly as he had through every piece of news that season, only shrugged one final time and said, "Maybe." The old people who still tell this story insist that the farmer was not simply pretending not to care or performing some kind of practiced calm for the benefit of his watching neighbors. He felt the fear when the horse ran off, and the joy when it returned with company, and the grief when his son was hurt, the same as anyone else would have felt in his place. He only held each feeling loosely as it passed through him, the way you might hold water in 2 open, upturned hands, instead of closing his fists tightly around any single one of them and calling it, once and for all, the whole and final truth of his life. There is another old story about a student who wanted to understand something vast by carrying a small piece of it home in a jar, instead of standing where the whole of it could be felt. That story is next. There was once a young student, in one telling, who had heard so much about the great ocean to the east, its vastness, its depth, the way it seemed to hold the whole sky inside it at dawn, that he became determined to understand it completely. He made the long journey to the coast, and stood at the shore for a while, the cold water circling his ankles, the horizon stretching further than his eyes could follow in either direction. But the ocean was so vast, and so loud, and so full of wind and salt spray, that he found it difficult to think clearly there at all. So he did what seemed, to him, like the sensible thing. He filled a small clay jar with seawater, sealed it carefully, and carried it inland to his teacher's quiet hut, where he could study it properly, he thought, without distraction, at his own careful pace. He set the jar proudly on the table before his teacher. "Here," he said, "is the ocean. Now I can finally understand it, a little at a time, without all that wind and noise." The old teacher opened the jar, dipped one finger inside, and tasted the water. "Salty," he said, "exactly as salty as the whole ocean itself." He looked up at his student. "Tell me," he asked gently, "what do you imagine you will learn from this jar, sitting quietly on my table, that the ocean itself did not already offer you, for free, the moment you stood at its shore, with the cold water moving around your ankles?" The student had no answer. He remembered suddenly how the cold water had felt, and the particular gray color of the horizon that morning, and a feeling of smallness that had passed through him standing there, which no jar could ever quite hold or preserve. Some truths, the old teacher said, must be met directly, standing where they are, and cannot be gathered up in a jar and carried home to be studied later at a safer distance. The ocean, he added, smiling, will still be there tomorrow. It is not going anywhere. You may go back to it any time you like, and enter it more fully this time. There is another old story, lighter than this one, about a wealthy merchant who once tried to give a gift and received instead a lesson he did not expect. That story is next. There was once a wealthy merchant, in one telling, well known throughout the town for his generosity, who visited a small temple one afternoon and left a large sum of gold with the monk who lived there, expecting, quite naturally, deep gratitude and formal thanks in return, as was the custom in every other house he had ever given to. The monk accepted the bag of gold with the very same plain nod he might give for a bowl of rice offered by a poor farmer, said only, "Thank you," and set the bag aside without ceremony, returning at once to the sweeping he had been doing when the merchant arrived. The merchant, more than a little offended by this cool reception, could not help himself. "Do you have any idea," he said, "how much gold is in that bag? Most men in this town would fall to their knees at such a gift." The monk set down his broom and looked at the merchant calmly, without a trace of anger in his weathered face. "Why," he asked gently, "should I thank you? For what is, after all, entirely your own good fortune, the fortune of being able to give it all. If anyone here should give thanks this afternoon," he continued, "it should be you, for having been given the chance to give and the means to do it, and a place willing to receive it." The merchant left the temple that day thoroughly puzzled and more than a little annoyed, turning the monk's strange words over in his mind the whole walk home. But he found, in the years that followed, that he returned to that same brief exchange again and again, in quiet moments, and came, eventually, in his own old age, to understand it as one of the truest things anyone had ever said to him. Truer, he often thought, than any of the grateful bowing he had received from 100 other houses combined. There is another old story, quieter than this one, about two monks on a muddy road who learned something similar about carrying things far longer than necessary. That story is next. Two monks, in one telling, were traveling together on foot between two temples, a journey of several days across hill country and rice terraces, along a road that heavy rain had turned thick and heavy with mud for several days running. One was old, gray, at the temples, having walked this same road countless times, over many years of quiet service, his sandals worn thin from decades of travel. The other was young, still early in his training, still learning which rules mattered most, and why, and still prone to the small anxieties of someone new to the discipline. They had walked since early morning, saying little, the rain having finally stopped but left the whole countryside heavy and glistening, the rice paddies flooded silver on either side of the road. At a river crossing, where the road dipped low and the mud grew deepest, thick enough in places to swallow a sandal whole, they came upon a young woman standing at the water's edge, clearly hesitating. She was dressed in fine silk robes, dyed a deep and costly indigo, clearly on her way to some important occasion, a wedding, perhaps, or a formal visit to relatives in the next village, and stood there, unable to cross without ruining the delicate fabric in the thick, dark mud that separated her from the drier road ahead. She looked at the water and looked at her robes, and looked back toward the village she had come from, and did not know what to do, growing visibly more anxious as the afternoon light began to fade. The elder monk, without saying a single word, without even breaking his stride, simply walked over, lifted her carefully in his arms as though she weighed nothing at all, and carried her across the muddy crossing, her silk robes never once touching the water. He set her down gently on the drier ground on the far side, nodded once in a simple, courteous acknowledgement, and continued on his way, as if nothing at all unusual had happened, as if he had simply stepped around a puddle. The younger monk followed behind him in silence, his own sandals sinking into the very same mud. But something in his chest had gone tight and uneasy, and would not settle no matter how far they walked. Monks, in that order, were forbidden from touching women at all, under almost any circumstance. The younger monk knew this rule better than almost anything else he had been taught. He said nothing for the rest of that afternoon, turning the moment over and over in his mind as they walked. He said nothing through the evening meal at the guest house where they stopped for the night. He said nothing until the two of them were finally alone in their small shared room, the road outside now dark and quiet, the candle between them burning low. Finally, unable to hold it in any longer, he burst out. "We are not supposed to touch women," he said. "How could you carry her like that, back there at the river?" The elder monk looked at him, calm and a little amused, setting down the bowl of tea he had been holding. "I set her down by the river," he said, Hours ago. Are you still carrying her? The younger monk fell completely silent. He had nothing at all to say to that. And for the first time all afternoon, whatever he had been holding so tightly in his own chest, without even quite noticing it, finally loosened and set itself down somewhere on the dark road behind them, where it belonged. The moon rose over the guest house roof that night, calm and entirely unbothered by any of it. There is another old story, stranger than this one, about a man clinging to a vine on the edge of a cliff, who found, in the middle of the worst moment of his life, something unexpectedly sweet. That story is next. There is a very old parable, in one telling, said to come from the Buddha himself, about a man walking one evening across a wide, quiet field. He came, without warning, upon danger in his path, and found himself running, as fast as his legs would carry him, toward the edge of a cliff overlooking a deep, misty gorge. With no other way forward, he caught hold of a single thin vine growing over the cliff's edge and climbed down along it, his feet finding nothing but open air below him. He looked down and saw more danger waiting patiently at the bottom of the gorge, and understood all at once that he could not climb back up and could not safely climb down. He could only hang there, suspended between the two, holding the vine with both hands. Then he noticed something else. Two small mice, one perfectly white and one perfectly black, had appeared at the top of the vine, just above his hands, and had begun calmly, patiently, to gnaw at it, one small bite at a time, exactly the way mice always gnaw at anything left within their reach. The man understood, in that suspended moment, hanging between one danger above and another below, with the vine itself slowly being eaten away, that there was nothing left for him to do, and nowhere left for him to go, and no plan left to make. And it was exactly then, in that stillness, that he noticed, growing from a small crack in the rock face, directly within reach of his outstretched hand, a single wild strawberry, red and ripe, and glistening faintly with the evening's first dew. He reached out with one hand, keeping the other wrapped tightly around the thinning vine, plucked the strawberry, and placed it gently on his tongue. It was, he found, without any question at all, the single most delicious thing he had ever tasted in his entire life. The old teachers who tell this story never say what happened to the man after that, whether the vine held or gave way, whether he found some way up or some way down, or simply stayed there a while longer, suspended between two dangers, tasting one perfect strawberry. That is not, they say, the part of the story that matters. What matters is only this. In the very worst moment of his entire life, with danger above him and danger below him, and his only support being quietly eaten away, one small bite at a time, he still noticed the strawberry. And he still let himself taste it, fully, without rushing, exactly as though nothing else in the whole world existed in that single moment except its sweetness. There is one more old story tonight, from further west, in the high mountains, about a hermit who returned home one evening to find his own cave already occupied by demons. That story is next. High in the mountains west of here, in one telling, there lived a hermit yogi named Milarepa, who had spent many years alone in a small cave, meditating through every season, through summer heat and winter snow alike. One evening, returning from gathering firewood on the slopes below, he came back to find his cave already occupied. Demons filled it, from wall to wall, creatures with burning eyes and grotesque, shifting shapes, sitting insolently in his own meditation seat, baring their teeth, filling the small space with a heat and a menace that pressed against him the moment he ducked through the entrance. Milarepa, startled, tried what he knew. He chanted the protective mantras he had learned from his own teacher, expecting the demons to flee before the sacred sounds, exactly as the old stories always promised. Instead, they only grew louder and more numerous, their shapes multiplying in the firelight, as though his fear itself were feeding them. He tried reciting the deepest teachings he knew about the emptiness underlying all appearances, hoping wisdom alone might dissolve them where fear had failed. One demon, in the back, seemed to pause thoughtfully at this. The rest were entirely unmoved. Finally, exhausted and a little embarrassed at his own growing panic, Milarepa tried simply commanding them to leave, the way any exasperated man might shout at unwelcome guests. The demons only laughed, a sound like grinding stone, and settled in more comfortably still, entirely unbothered. Milarepa sat down finally, in the only open space left on the cold stone floor, and simply stopped fighting. He understood, all at once, something he had missed in all his chanting and commanding. These demons were not separate from his own fear. The more he resisted them, the more real, and the more numerous, they became. So he tried something entirely different. He looked around at the fearsome shapes filling his small cave, and instead of fighting them, he welcomed them, as honored guests, however unexpected their visit. "If you have come to stay," he said quietly, "please stay. There is room enough here for all of us." "If you have come to eat me," he continued, calmer still, "then eat me now. I no longer need to defend myself from you." One by one, startled by welcome where they had expected only fear, the demons began to waver at the edges, growing thin and uncertain, unsure what to do with a man who no longer resisted them at all. Most of them simply faded away entirely, like morning mist burning off in early sunlight, leaving the cave quieter with each passing moment. Only one remained. The largest and the fiercest of them all, its mouth wide enough, it seemed, to swallow the whole cave entrance. Milarepa, without hesitation now, walked calmly toward it, and placed his own head gently inside its open mouth. "If my body will nourish you," he said softly, "take it gladly. I have nothing left that I am unwilling to give." At this final, complete surrender of every last trace of fear, the great demon shuddered once, and dissolved entirely into a soft, rainbow-colored light, which settled quietly onto the stone wall of the cave and faded, leaving behind only the faint outline of a handprint in colors no ordinary paint could match. Pilgrims, it is said, still climb to that cave today, to see the handprint that remains. What we resist, the old teachers say, tends to persist and grow larger the harder we push against it. What we welcome instead, fully, without flinching, tends quietly to dissolve on its own, exactly the way morning mist dissolves once the sun is finally allowed to reach it. There is another old story about a monk who spent almost his entire life trying to give something away, and who succeeded, in the end, in a way he never quite expected. That story is next. There was once a monk, in one telling, named Tetsugen, who noticed, early in his life, that his country had no printed edition of the Buddhist sutras that ordinary people could actually afford to own. Only wealthy temples possessed the old handwritten scrolls, copied laboriously over generations, far too rare and precious for anyone else to read. Tetsugen resolved, quietly and without announcement, to change this, and began traveling from town to town, collecting small donations toward the printing of a complete edition, one that any village temple might someday afford to own. Some who gave were wealthy, and gave generously, expecting to see their names honored in the finished work. Far more who gave were poor, offering only a few small coins pressed into his hand after a long day's labor, apologizing for how little they had to spare. Tetsugen received every single donation, from the richest merchant and the poorest farmer alike, with exactly the same quiet gratitude, recording no distinction between them in his careful ledger. After 10 long years of this patient collecting, walking from village to village in every season, Tetsugen finally had gathered enough money to begin the printing at last. But that very year, a terrible famine spread across the region, leaving whole villages without enough rice to see the winter through. Tetsugen, without a moment's hesitation, took every coin he had collected over that entire decade and used it instead to buy rice for the starving villages, feeding thousands of people who would otherwise have gone hungry through the cold months. Then, with nothing left, he began his collecting all over again, from the very beginning, exactly as he had the first time. Years passed, and Tetsugen collected patiently once more, walking the same roads, knocking on the same doors, never once complaining of having to begin again. Eventually, he gathered enough a second time. And once again, just as he prepared to begin the printing at last, disaster struck a different province entirely. A great flood this time, leaving thousands homeless and sick along a swollen river. Tetsugen, exactly as before, without the slightest hesitation, gave away every coin to help those in need, and began collecting a third time, from nothing at all, though he was by now no longer a young man. This third time, at last, nothing interfered. The years of collecting were finally, quietly, complete, and the printing began. And after decades of patient work, since his very first coin collected, the sutras were finally set in print, and copies were carried to village temples across the whole country, where ordinary people could read them for the very first time in their lives. Today, in the towns where this story is still told, the people say that Tetsugen printed the sutras 3 times. The first 2 editions, they say, are invisible. The rice that fed the starving, and the aid that saved the drowning and the sick, printed nowhere on any page. And they say, quietly, that those 2 invisible editions were worth far more than the third, the one you can actually hold in your hands today. Tetsugen never once complained of the delays, or the decades, or the 2 times he had to begin his life's work again from absolutely nothing. He simply held his own goal loosely enough, it seems, to let it go, twice, for something more urgent, and returned to it patiently, both times, exactly as calm as the moment he first began. There is one final story tonight, quieter than all the others, about an old hermit who owned almost nothing at all, and gave away, without a second thought, even that. That story is our last. 4 young monks, in one telling, agreed together, with great seriousness, to observe a single night of perfect and unbroken silence, as a discipline meant to steady the mind. They sat together in a small meditation hall that evening, cross-legged, facing one another, in a loose circle, with a single candle burning in the center of the room between them, its small flame the only light in the whole building. The rule they had agreed upon was simple and strict. Whoever spoke first, for any reason at all, would have failed the discipline completely, and would owe the other 3 a full day of chores as penance. The first hour passed in perfect, unbroken stillness. Only the small sounds of the building settling and the distant call of some night bird far off in the trees disturbed the quiet at all. The second hour passed the same way, the candle flame standing straight and steady in the windless room, each monk sitting with his own thoughts, proud, in his own quiet way, of how well the discipline was holding. But as the night grew later and the temple grew colder, a thin draught crept in beneath the old wooden door, and the candle flame began to flicker and gutter and lean dangerously to one side, threatening to go out completely and leave all 4 of them sitting together in total darkness. The first monk, without thinking, cried out, "The candle! It's going out!" The second monk turned to him at once, scandalized, forgetting entirely, in his outrage, that he too was about to break the very silence he was defending. "You spoke," he said. "You have broken the silence, after all this time." The third monk, indignant now on behalf of the whole discipline they had worked so hard to keep, could not help himself either. "You have both spoken now," he said, his voice rising. "You are fools, the both of you, after everything we agreed." The fourth monk had sat through all of this, without moving, without a single word, watching his 3 companions undo the entire night's careful discipline, one after another, each one certain he alone was in the right. Finally, in the quiet that followed, once all 3 had fallen silent again, embarrassed, he allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile. "I," he said, quite pleased with himself, "am the only one among us who has not spoken a single word tonight." The old people who tell this story always laugh gently here, and remind their listeners that even a silence guarded with the very best of intentions can be broken by the smallest, most ordinary things in the world. A flickering candle, a hasty accusation, a little pride arriving right at the very end, exactly when no one expects it. Even silence, it turns out, must be held loosely, like water in 2 open hands, rather than gripped and defended as though it belonged entirely to you. There is another old story, much older than the others tonight, about a young ascetic prince who once held his own convictions so tightly that he very nearly starved himself to death because of them. A bowl of warm rice, offered by a stranger, taught him something his own iron will never could. That story is next. Long before he was known by the name, the whole world remembers him by now. In one telling, there was a young prince who had left his palace years earlier, determined to find the end of all human suffering. He believed, as many wise teachers of his time believed, that suffering itself, taken to its very limit, might somehow burn away suffering. So he fasted, further and further, reducing his food over the months to almost nothing at all, sitting motionless through storms and through burning heat alike, determined to master his own body completely through sheer force of will. His body wasted nearly to nothing. His ribs showed plainly beneath skin, gone thin and gray as old paper. 5 companions, ascetics like himself, had fasted alongside him for years, watching him with a mixture of awe and growing concern. Yet no peace had come to him, for all of it. Only a deeper exhaustion in the body, and, he began to suspect, in the mind as well. One morning, sitting beneath a great tree beside a quiet river, too weak now to move, even if he had wished to, he came very near, in this telling, to the very edge of death itself. That same morning, a young village woman named Sujata came to that very tree, carrying a golden bowl filled with warm milk rice, having promised long ago to make such an offering to the spirit of the tree if her prayers for a healthy child were ever answered. Her prayers had been answered that very season, and so she had come, as promised, to give thanks. Seeing the thin, motionless figure sitting so still beneath the tree, wasted almost beyond recognition as a living man, she mistook him, for one brief and trembling moment, for the tree spirit itself, come to receive her offering in person. She knelt and offered the warm bowl gently into his hands, bowing her head in gratitude. The prince looked down at the bowl for a long moment. Every belief he had built his entire recent life around told him to refuse it, to continue on toward some imagined purity through further denial. And yet, quietly, without announcing the thought even to himself, he accepted the bowl and ate. His 5 companions, watching from a short distance away, saw him eat and believed, with great disappointment, that he had simply given up, weak and defeated, abandoning the difficult path entirely. They left him there that same day, in disgust, certain he would never find what he had set out so many years before to find. Alone now, and nourished for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, the prince sat quietly by the river and understood something new. Neither the life of comfort he had left behind in his father's palace, nor the life of extreme self-denial he had pursued so fiercely since, held the answer he had been searching for. Only a middle way, walked gently, gripped tightly by neither extreme, could carry him any further than either one alone ever could. It was beneath a different tree, not long after that quiet morning by the river, still nourished by that single bowl of rice, that he finally found the peace he had spent so many years searching for. The old people who tell this story say Sujata never knew, for the rest of her own quiet life, that the bowl of rice she had almost been too frightened to offer, fearing, for a moment, that the still figure beneath the tree might be some fearsome forest spirit, rather than a man, helped to nourish the very peace the whole world would come to know by an entirely different name. There was once an old teacher, closer to home, who was accused of the worst thing a man in his position could possibly be accused of, and who answered every single accusation for years afterward with exactly the same 4 quiet words. That story is next. There was once an old teacher, in one telling, who lived alone at the edge of a village, in a small house surrounded by a garden. He tended every morning without fail, rain or shine, rows of vegetables and a few flowering trees. He had planted himself as a much younger man. He was known by everyone, near and far, for a certain calm that nothing seemed able to disturb. Not praise, when it came his way, as it often did from villagers grateful for his quiet counsel. Not criticism, when that came instead, as it sometimes did from those who found his stillness unnerving. Not good fortune, and not bad, whichever the season happened to bring him. One season, a young unmarried woman in the village was found to be with child. Her parents, furious and deeply ashamed before their neighbors, in a village where such things were spoken of in scandalized whispers, for years afterward, demanded again and again to know who the father was. Frightened and desperate to protect the young man she truly loved, a merchant's apprentice whose family would never have accepted her, not with her own family's modest standing, she said the old teacher's name instead, the first name that came to her in her panic, a name everyone in the village would recognize and believe without question. Her parents marched to his door that very evening in a fury, the whole village gathering along a road to watch, torches and lanterns held high against the dark, and laid the accusation at his feet without ceremony, along with the infant himself. Once the child was born some months later, wrapped in a plain cloth, and set down at his threshold like an unwanted debt. The old teacher listened to every single word of it, without protest, without raising his voice, without so much as a flicker of anger crossing his weathered face, standing quietly in his doorway, as the accusations rained down around him. When they had finally finished, exhausted from their own shouting, their torches beginning to gutter in the night wind, he said only, "Is that so?" And then, without another word, without asking a single question in his own defense, he took the child into his arms, gently, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment his whole life, and began, from that very day, to raise the boy as his own son. The whole village turned against him, after that, almost overnight. His reputation, carefully built over an entire lifetime of quiet service, was gone within a single season. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly on the road would no longer meet his eyes, crossing to the far side of the street whenever they saw him coming. Every morning, without fail, he walked from door to door with the child on his hip, asking for milk and rice and whatever small kindness anyone would still offer him, enduring every closed door and every whispered word behind his back with exactly the same unbroken calm. "Is that so?" he would say, quietly, whenever anyone repeated the old accusation to his face, thinking to wound him with it all over again. Nothing more than that. Never any explanation, never any plea for understanding. Years passed this way, one season folding quietly into the next. The child grew tall and healthy, and laughed at simple things the way children do, entirely unaware of the quiet cost his own upbringing had placed on the old man who raised him. Eventually, the young mother, grown older herself now, and worn down at last by years of her own private guilt, confessed the whole truth to her parents. The real father, she admitted through tears, was a young man from the market, someone she had been too afraid to name at the time, all those years ago. Ashamed and deeply sorry, her parents went at once to the old teacher's door, begging his forgiveness, asking humbly for the child to be returned to his true mother. The old teacher listened to all of it, exactly as calmly as he had listened to the original accusation all those years before. When they had finished, he handed the child over gently, without hesitation, and said only, "Is that so?" No relief performed for anyone watching. No bitterness quietly held on to, either, after everything he had endured. Only the same 4 words he had offered on the very first day, and on every single day since. The old people who tell this story say some people are so entirely at peace with whatever life brings them, in either direction, that even the harshest injustice moves through them, the way weather moves through an open sky, leaving no lasting mark behind at all. There was another old teacher, further up the mountain, who understood something similar about owning very little in this world, and giving away, without complaint, even that. Our last story tonight is his. High on a quiet mountainside, in one telling, there lived an old hermit poet, who owned almost nothing at all in this world, having given away, over the many years of his solitary life, nearly everything he had ever been given. A single robe, patched at both elbows. A simple wooden bowl, chipped along one edge from years of use. A few thin books of poems he had written himself over the years, in a small careful hand, by lamplight, in the long quiet evenings, and had never once shown to anyone else. Not out of shyness, but simply because it had never occurred to him that anyone might want to see them. His hut was so small and so entirely bare that even the mice, it was said by the villagers below, who occasionally left rice at the base of the mountain path for him, sometimes left it disappointed, having found nothing at all worth the climb, no grain stored away, no scraps forgotten in a corner. He was known throughout the valley for his poems, simple verses about the changing seasons, about the particular way frost formed on bamboo leaves, about the sound rain made on his thin roof at night, verses that villagers would sometimes recite to their children, though few of them had ever actually met the old man who wrote them. One clear autumn night, while the old man was out walking beneath the full moon, exactly as he often did, finding more company in its light than in any human conversation, wandering the mountain paths he knew by heart even in darkness, a thief crept quietly up the mountain path and slipped inside his hut, searching for anything at all worth taking. He searched the low shelves along the wall, running his hands over the empty spaces. He searched the small wooden chest beside the door, finding only folded cloth and a few worn writing brushes. He found nothing, not one single object of any value at all in the entire small room, not even a coin, not even a single item that might fetch a modest price in the village market below. Just as he was turning to leave, empty-handed, and more than a little embarrassed at his own wasted climb up the mountain in the dark and the cold, his feet already sore from the steep path, the old man returned along the path outside, humming quietly to himself, and found the thief standing there in his own doorway, caught, with absolutely nowhere left to run, the moonlight falling full on both their faces. The old man did not raise an alarm or call out for help from the village below. He did not reach for anything to defend himself or even raise his voice. Instead, he looked at the thief for a long moment with something close to sympathy, the way you might look at a traveler who had lost his way in the dark. "You may have come a long way up this mountain, in the cold, just to see me," he said gently. "You should not leave with nothing at all to show for the climb." And with that, without a trace of hesitation, he untied his own robe, the only one he owned in the whole world, and offered it gently to the stunned thief. The thief took it without a single word, too confused by the whole encounter to do anything else, and fled down the dark mountain path into the night, the robe bundled awkwardly under one arm. The old man sat down alone in the doorway of his now entirely empty hut, wearing nothing at all against the cold night air, and watched the thief's small shadow disappear down the winding path far below. He did not seem troubled by the cold in the slightest. He looked up instead at the enormous pale, patient moon hanging low and full over the whole silent mountain, exactly as it had every clear night of his life. "Poor man," he said quietly, to no one at all, since no one was there to hear him. "I wish I could have given him this beautiful moon as well." The moon hung there all night long, exactly as it always had, needing nothing at all for itself, keeping nothing back, giving its quiet light equally to the mountain, and the empty hut, and the thief's retreating shadow, and the old man's bare shoulders, all at the very same time, without ever once running out. Down below, far past the mountain, other quiet things are settling now for the night. A cup, empty and dry, sits alone on a low wooden table, its lesson long since learned. A farmer's field rests quiet under that same patient sky, waiting for whatever the next season may or may not bring. A muddy road has gone still, its water settled, its old weight let go and forgotten. A single candle has burned all the way down, peacefully, in a small dark room, its silence no longer needing to be defended by anyone at all. A grown child, once carried gently in the arms of a man who owed him nothing but received him anyway, sleeps somewhere tonight, untroubled, never having known the quiet cost of his own peaceful childhood. And high on the mountain, an old man sits a while longer in his open doorway, holding nothing at all in his hands or in his heart, and wanting for nothing else either. The night is very still now. The ink is still wet, and the water has settled.